The wheelchair tips on the icy ramp, and the old man goes down hard against the porch rail, one hand clawing for a wheel that will not hold. Snow comes sideways across the gravel lot of the hardware store, and for 3 full seconds nobody moves. The man cannot see the ground he is falling toward. His cane skids off the boards and disappears under a drift. Somewhere behind a frosted window, a radio plays indifferent, and the wind takes the sound and scatters it down the empty street. Then a dog crosses the lot at a flat run, low and silent, and a man in a faded field jacket follows 3 strides behind, and the morning stops being ordinary. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he had not meant to stop in Halden Forge at all. He was passing through, the way he passed through most places now, with a full tank and a dog in the passenger seat and no particular reason to be anywhere by nightfall. He was 41 years old, broad through the shoulders in a way that made doorways feel narrow, with a weathered face that had taken a lot of weather and a short crop of dark hair gone gray at the temples. There was a thin scar along the left side of his jaw, pale against the stubble, and his eyes had the cast of someone who never fully stopped checking rooms, roads, exits, and people. 12 years, a Marine, the last 4 of them running logistics for disaster relief, and somewhere in all that loading and unloading he had misplaced the trick of staying put. The dog reached the old man first. The dog always reached things first. He was a German shepherd, large and disciplined, with a classic tannin black saddle coat and a black mask across his muzzle, and his name was Boone. He did not bark. He planted himself against the old man's shoulder like a brace, and held there, taking the weight, while the man's free hand found the thick fur and gripped. "Easy," Daniel said, going down to one knee on the ice. "I've got you. Don't pull. Let the dog hold, and I'll lift on 3. The old man's face turned toward the sound of his voice, and that was when Daniel understood. The eyes were open, pale, and clouded, fixed on nothing. They did not track the dog or the hand or the snow. They simply pointed at the world without receiving it. "I can't find my cane," the old man said. His voice was steady in a way that cost him something. It went off the edge. "I'd be grateful if you wouldn't make a thing of this." Daniel got an arm under him and lifted slow, and the old man came up lighter than a grown man should. Boone shifted with them, never more than a breath from the old man's side. They got him back into the chair, and Daniel felt the problem. The moment the weight settled, the left wheel canted inward. The frame had a flex in it that no frame should have. When he rocked it gently, the whole left side gave a soft, grinding complaint, metal on metal where a bearing should have been. "This chair's broken," Daniel said. "This chair is 4 months old," the old man answered. That answer stayed in Daniel's head longer than he expected. If a story has ever made you slow down and care about a stranger, stay with this one to the end, because what that broken wheel was hiding turned out to be bigger than one old man on one icy morning. The old man's name was Harlan Webb. He was 78 tall once, and now folded down by years into something spare and careful, with thinning white hair under a gray knit cap and big hands gone soft and spotted, hands that had clearly built things for a living before they stopped being able to see what they built. He wore a heavy canvas coat, patched at one elbow, and a flannel shirt buttoned to the throat. He had been blind for 6 years. He said glaucoma that came on slow, and then all at once, and he lived alone in a house his father had framed by hand on the edge of town. Daniel walked him home because there was no version of the morning where he did not. Boone walked between them, matching the old man's shuffle, and Harlan kept one hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulders. And by the second block, the dog had decided something about him that Daniel had learned not to argue with. The house sat at the end of Cobb Street, where the pavement gave out into frozen ruts. It was a narrow two-story with a deep porch, and the porch was where the trouble lived. Someone had built a wheelchair ramp down off the side of it, a long plywood thing, and built it badly. Daniel saw the slope before they reached it. Too steep, no rails worth the name. A surface that turned to glass the moment the temperature dropped, which in these mountains was most of the winter. "Who built your ramp, Mr. Webb? The same people who sold me the chair?" Harlan found the doorframe by memory and leaned there, catching his breath. "Cardinal Mobility. They came around in the fall. Said they had a program for veterans and seniors. Said the county had grant money set aside, and all I had to do was sign. I served in the Navy, 1965 to 69. They knew that before I told them. They knew a lot before I told them." Inside, the house was clean and bare and arranged with the fierce precision of a man who could not afford to lose track of anything. Every chair had its place. A cord ran along the baseboard so he could follow it room to room. On the wall hung framed photographs he could no longer see. A woman with a kind, sharp face in most of them, and Daniel did not ask. "My wife passed 2 years back," Harlan said, as if he had heard the question anyway. "Ruth, she handled the money, the mail, the people who come to the door. I'm no good at any of it. They knew that, too." Daniel made coffee because his hands needed something to do. Boone settled by the old man's feet and put his chin on the worn boot and stayed there. And Harlan reached down and found the big head and rested his palm on it, and his face did something it had not done on the icy lot. It eased. "He chose you," Daniel said. "He doesn't do that with everybody, smart dog." Harlan's thumb moved slow over the dog's ear, "Smarter than the men who sold me a chair that tried to kill me this morning." That hit Daniel harder than he expected. He thought about getting back in the truck. He thought about it the way you think, about a door you already know you are not going to walk through. He stayed instead. A chair could be fixed, and fixing things was a thing he still knew how to do when the larger machinery of his life had stopped making sense. He carried the chair out to the porch in the gray afternoon light and turned it over across 2 sawhorses he found in the shed, and what he saw made him sit back on his heels. The chair was junk dressed up to look like medicine. He took the left wheel off first, the one that had canted inward and dumped a blind man onto frozen plywood, and the axle nut came loose in his fingers with no tool at all. Finger tight, the way no axle nut on a chair a man trusts his weight to should ever be. The bearing that had ground all morning was not failing. It had never been there. The housing was empty, packed with a wad of gray foam, the soft kind that comes around a shipped television, jammed in to quiet the rattle long enough to get past a man who could not see it. Daniel pulled the foam out and held it in his palm and looked at it for a while. A man had to kneel down and decide to do that. A man had to think it through, had to know that a blind buyer would never take a wheel off, would never feel the wrongness until the morning the wrongness put him on the ground. The frame welds were cold and porous when he ran a thumbnail across them, the kind a shop turns out when it is paid by the unit and not by the hour, beads laid down fast and ugly and skinned over to look finished. He checked the brake. The brake was a stamped tin lever that bore on the tire with a friction pad already worn to the rivet. 4 months in, the seat sling was nylon webbing, a third the width of the real thing. Every single part of the chair was the cheapest version of itself, and every single part had been chosen by somebody who knew exactly who would be sitting in it. The brand plate riveted to the side said Cardinal Mobility Solutions, and under it, stamped small in the aluminum, was a part number and a second mark, a little cardinal in flight, and Daniel ran his thumb over it the way Harlan ran his thumb over the dog. Boone lifted his head and looked down the street. Daniel followed the look. A dark SUV had come up Cobb Street slow and stopped where the pavement ended, engine running, and a man sat behind the wheel, not getting out, just watching the porch. The snow on the windshield had been wiped clear. He had been there long enough to need to wipe it. "You expecting anybody, Mr. Webb?" "Never." Harlan had come to the door, one hand on the frame. "Why, no reason yet." The SUV sat a moment longer, then it backed down the ruts, turned in the wide spot by the dead fire hydrant, and left. Daniel memorized the plate without deciding to. Some habits do not retire when you do. That night he did not sleep in the truck. Why? Harlan had a spare room, his daughter's old room, the daughter who lived in Ohio and called on Sundays, and did not know about the chair because Harlan had not told her, because Harlan did not want to be the kind of father his children had to drive across a state to rescue. Daniel understood that better than he wanted to. He lay in a child's narrow bed under a quilt that smelled of cedar, and Boone lay across the doorway the way he always did, and Daniel listened to the old house tick and settle, and thought about an empty bearing housing packed with foam. Morning came gray and bitter, the kind of cold that gets into the welds of a man as easily as a chair. Daniel made breakfast, and then he made a list. In his head, the way he used to stage a convoy. He needed to know 3 things: who Cardinal Mobility was, how many chairs they had sold in this county, and whether the cardinal stamped under the brand plate matched the cardinal on whatever paperwork Harlan had signed. The paperwork was in a shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet because Ruth had always kept the paperwork in a shoebox on the top shelf of the hall closet, and Harlan had kept the habit going by feel after she was gone. Daniel brought it down. Most of it was old. Tax letters, a paid-off mortgage, a folded flag certificate from a brother who had not come home from a war older than either of them. And near the top, newer, a glossy folder with a red bird on the cover. The contract inside was a small masterpiece of harm. It was written to look like a gift. Cardinal Mobility Solutions, in partnership with the Heartland Veterans Mobility Fund, was pleased to provide Mr. Richter. Harlan with a premium mobility solution at no upfront cost, the cost to be recovered through a county wellness grant, and a modest monthly service agreement. The modest monthly service agreement was $91 for 60 months, on a chair that a working catalog would have sold new and whole for $400. Daniel did the arithmetic twice because he did not believe it the first time. $5,460 drafted automatically from a man's account every month for 5 years for a chair with foam where the bearing should be. "Mr. Webb, do you know what you're paying for this chair?" "Close. They said the grant covered most of it." Harlan's hand had stopped on the dog's head. "They said my part was small. 90-some a month. I think it comes out the same day my Navy pension comes in. So I never miss it, never see it, really. There's no grant." Daniel kept his voice level, the way you keep your voice level when the worst part is the part you have not said yet. There's no county money. You're paying full freight and then some every month, straight to them. The old house ticked. Outside, snow began again, slow and steady, over Cobb Street. Inside, something in Harlan's careful arrangement of the world came quietly apart, and he sat very still while it did, And Boone pressed up against his leg and held there, and Daniel watched a proud man absorb the size of what had been done to him without raising his voice once. Ruth would have caught it, Harlan said finally. In the first sentence, she'd have caught it. Maybe. You've got something now, though, that you didn't have this morning. What's that? Me and the dog. If you are still with Harlan, stay with him, because this is the part where it stops being one chair. The next morning, Daniel drove into town with the brand plate in his coat pocket, pried loose with a screwdriver and wrapped in a shop rag, and Boone riding the seat with his nose to the gap in the window. Halden Forge was a town the size of a held breath. One main street with a diner, a feed store, a pharmacy, a barber, and a county annex office that opened at 9 and closed whenever the one clerk inside decided it had. The clerk was a woman named Della Pruitt, 60s, sharp-eyed, with reading glasses on a chain and a way of looking at a stranger that catalogued him in about 4 seconds. You're the one staying out at Harlan's, it was not a question. In a town that size, nothing was a question for long. Word is you carried him home off the hardware lot. His chair's defective. Worse than defective, he's being robbed by the company that sold it to him. Daniel set the brand plate on the counter and unwrapped it. Cardinal Mobility. You heard the name? Della Pruitt looked at the little red bird stamped in the aluminum, and her mouth went flat. She did not answer right away. She got up, walked to the door of the annex, looked out at the empty street, and turned the deadbolt. Then she came back. Harlan isn't the first, she said. He's the 9th that I know of. Probably more I don't. They've been working the back roads of 3 counties since September, old folks. Folks living alone, folks who can't drive in to complain and don't have family close enough to notice the bank statement. She took off the reading glasses. My Aunt Lorna's one of them, 84. Same chair, same red bird, same little monthly bite that lands the day her Social Security does. I've been trying to get somebody to listen for 2 months. You know what a wellness grant is worth as a complaint? Nothing. There's no grant to complain about. It doesn't exist, so there's nothing to investigate. So nobody investigate. Daniel felt the old machinery turn over in him, the part that used to look at a flooded county and a list of what was needed, and start, quietly, to solve it. 9 people, same chair, same contract. Same contract. I've seen 3 of them now, word for word. Della pulled a folder from under the counter where she had apparently been keeping it close. I made copies. I'm not supposed to. I did anyway. Who comes to collect when something goes wrong? When a chair breaks, who shows up? A man named Vance Ottinger. She said the name the way you say a name you have practiced saying to the right person. Drives a black SUV. Real smooth. Calls himself a regional care coordinator. Comes around, makes a note, promises a service visit that never happens, and reminds them real gentle that the monthly draft is part of the agreement they signed. Her jaw tightened. He came to see my aunt twice. Second time, he sat in her kitchen and told her how lucky she was that the program existed. She thanked him. She made him coffee. I could have put my hand through the wall. Boone, who had been lying flat by the door, lifted his head and looked at the street. And a moment later, a dark SUV rolled slow past the annex window and did not stop. Della saw Daniel see it. That's him. I know, Daniel said. He was outside Harlan's yesterday. Here is what Daniel understood. Standing in a locked county office with a stolen brand plate on the counter and a town clerk's hidden folder in his hand. Ottinger was not careless. A careless man does not pack foam into an empty bearing housing to buy 4 months of silence. A careful man does that. A careful man writes a contract, that hides a robbery inside the shape of a gift, times the draft to the day a pension lands, so the victim never feels the wound, and picks targets who cannot read the fine print and have no one near who will. Ottinger had built the whole thing to be invisible to exactly the people he was robbing, which meant the way to take it apart was not to confront him. It was to make it visible to people who could see. "I need three things," Daniel said. "I need every contract you can get your hands on with the names on them. I need to know where these chairs are actually made, because there's a real shop somewhere turning out junk to spec. And I need somebody with a badge or a license who isn't in this county. Because whatever this is, it crosses county lines, and a thing that crosses county lines belongs to the state." Della Pruitt looked at him for a long moment. "You sound like a man who's done this before. I've staged relief operations. Same skill. You find what people need, you find who has it, and you build the line between them." He looked down at the brand plate. "Only this time, the thing people need is for somebody to finally look. The looking took 11 days, and Daniel built it the way he built everything, one verified piece at a time. He started with the chairs themselves. The part number, under the cardinal, was not random. He spent a long, cold evening at the diner with the pharmacy owner's laptop and a phone signal that came and went, and he traced the number through a supplier index to a fabrication shop 2 counties east, a place called Rampart Fab that made unbranded mobility frames by the pallet. $61. Daniel wrote the number on a napkin and looked at it next to the other number, the 5,460, and the distance between those two numbers was the whole crime. He did not call Rampart Fab. He drove there, 2 counties east, on roads that climbed and fell through bare gray timber, with Boone riding the seat and the brand plate wrapped in its rag on the dash. The shop was a low steel building behind a chain-link fence with a yard full of frames stacked on pallets and shrink-wrapped against the weather, and the cold smell of cut aluminum hanging over all of it. He took Boone and the brand plate, and he stood in the gravel and talked to a foreman named Pete Quill, a heavy, tired man in coveralls, with a welder's squint and forearms scarred pale from 30 years of sparks, who had no idea his frames were being dressed up as veteran medical grants. Quill listened with his arms crossed at first, the way a man listens to a stranger who has driven onto his property with a complaint. Then Daniel handed him the brand plate and told him about the foam in the bearing housing, and the crossed arms came down. Quill turned the plate over in his big hand and read the part number, and his face changed by degrees, and he got quieter and quieter as Daniel laid it out. The contract, the phantom grant, the $91 a month time to a pension, the old man on the ice. "That's my frame," Quill said at last, low. "That's my part number. That's not my chair." He pulled the order, records himself, walked Daniel into a cramped office that smelled of coffee and machine oil, and pulled up the account on a computer older than the truck outside. Cardinal Mobility had bought 240 frames since August. 240. Paid by wire, picked up by an unmarked box truck at the loading dock, by a driver who never gave a name. No service contract, no parts order, no cushions, no brakes. Nothing that a real medical supplier would ever skip, because a real supplier finishes a chair, and these people were finishing them somewhere else, cheap, in the dark. "I sell to clinics," Quill said. "I sell to 2 VA hospitals through a broker, and the broker checks my welds with a gauge before he writes the check. I don't sell to whatever this is." He hit print. The old machine chattered out page after page without being asked. "You take this to whoever you're taking it to. I'll sign whatever they need. I'll drive wherever they need me to drive." My name's stamped on the good chairs in half the nursing homes in this state. My mother's in one of them, in a chair I built. I am not going down quiet with a man I never met because he liked my prices. That was the first time Daniel let himself believe it might hold, not because of the paper, though the paper mattered, because of the way a tired man in a cold yard had heard the truth and refused to stand on the wrong side of it. That was the thing the scam had bet against. It had bet that nobody would look, and that if anybody did, they would look away. It had not planned for the looking to be contagious. The community came the way community comes in places like Halden Forge, sideways and unasked. Della told the pharmacy owner, who told the diner cook, who turned out to have a cousin who was one of the 9, an old farmer named Earl Tibbets, whose chair had thrown him into a snowbank in December and who had been too embarrassed to tell anyone. Earl told 2 more. By the end of the first week, Daniel had names and contracts for 14 people across 3 counties, all of them old, most of them alone, every one of them paying a phantom grant down to a real company's account. A retired bookkeeper named Sylvia Crane, 70, who had lost her own sight to the same disease as Harlan, went through every contract with a magnifying glass and a steadiness that humbled the room, and found the thing Daniel had missed. The monthly drafts did not go to Cardinal Mobility at all. They went to a holding company. And the holding company's registered agent listed in the small print on the back page that no blind man would ever read was Vance Ottinger. He signed it himself, Sylvia said. Right there. He was so sure no one would ever turn the page over. She set the magnifier down. I turned it over. Daniel laid the whole thing out on Harlan's kitchen table over 3 nights. And Harlan, who could not see a page of it, became the center of it anyway. He remembered things. He remembered the exact words the salesman had used in the fall, the cadence of the pitch, the way the man had mentioned Harlan's Navy years before Harlan had said them. And he remembered that the man had asked gently whether anyone else helped him with his finances and had seemed pleased by the answer. Sylvia wrote it all down. A blind man's memory, it turned out, was a clean and terrible record, because a man who cannot see learns to hold every word he hears. They asked if I was alone, Harlan said one night, his hand on Boone's head, the dog having claimed the spot under the table as his own. That was the real question. Everything else was decoration. They wanted to know if I was alone. He was quiet a moment. I told them, yes. God help me. I was proud of it. I thought it meant I was managing. You're not alone now, Daniel said. No. Harlan's clouded eyes were wet, and he did not wipe them, because a man who cannot see his own tears sometimes forgets to hide them. No, I don't believe I am. There was a night it nearly came apart. Ottinger was careful, and careful men protect what they build. On the 9th day, the monthly drafts stopped, all of them at once, across all 14 accounts. At first it looked like mercy. It was not mercy. Della came to the house with her face gray and said the holding company had filed to dissolve, that the registered agent had changed to a name nobody recognized, that the office address it had listed turned out to be a rented mailbox in a strip mall that had already been emptied. Ottinger had felt the ground shift. He was closing the doors and walking out the back, and if those doors closed clean, there would be nothing left to point at. A dissolved company cannot be sued by a town clerk in a drifting marine. The draft stopping was not the end of the robbery. It was the robber wiping his prints. Daniel sat in the dark kitchen that night and felt the old failure rise in him, the conviction that he had come too late, the way he always came too late, the way he had once driven a relief truck into a county, the day after the people who needed it had already gone. Boone got up from under the table and came and put his head on Daniel's knee, uninvited, and held it there, heavy and warm, and Daniel sat with his hand in the dog's fur and made himself think instead of grieve. A dissolved company could not be sued. A dissolved company was still a record, though. 240 frames at $61. 14 signed contracts, soon more. A foreman who would testify, a registered agent who had put his own name on the back page in his own hand before he learned to hide it. The robbery was over, but the robbery had left a shape in the world exactly the size of Vance Ottinger, and you did not need the company to exist to point at the shape. "We're not suing him," Daniel said the next morning to Della and Sylvia and Harlan at the kitchen table with coffee going cold. "We were never going to be the ones to do that. We're not the law. We're the witnesses. Our whole job was to make this loud enough and clear enough and true enough that the people whose job it is can't pretend they didn't hear it." He spread the folders across the table, the contracts and the order history, and Sylvia's notes, and the photograph he had taken of the foam packed into an empty bearing. "And now it's loud." He drove the whole package, 2 counties over, and then to the state capitol to the office of the Consumer Protection Division of the Attorney General, because elder financial fraud across county lines was exactly the kind of thing that office existed for and exactly the kind of thing no single county had the reach to chase. He did not go alone. Della came with her Aunt Lorna's contract in her purse. Quill drove down from Rampart Fab on his own gas with his order records in a manila envelope. And on a cold, bright morning in a marble hallway that smelled of floor wax and old paper, a drifting marine and a town clerk and a tired foreman and a folder full of an old man's exact remembered words were finally, after 2 months of nobody listening. The investigator was a woman named Renata Voss, 15 years in the division, who had seen a great many folders and was not easily moved by any of them, and who went very still when she reached the page with the foam in the bearing housing and the part number that led to a $61 frame. She asked good questions. She asked them for 2 hours. When Daniel laid out the timing of the drafts against the pension and Social Security deposit dates, the way each victim's small monthly wound had been placed precisely where they would not feel it, something in her face hardened into purpose. "This is the cleanest fraud package anyone has walked into this office with in a year," she said. "Most people bring me anger. You brought me a map." She squared the folders. "The dissolution doesn't protect him. It never does. We can pierce it. We've got his name on the agent filing. We've got the frame purchases. We've got 14 victims and counting who'll testify. And we've got intent written all over the timing. He didn't make a mistake. He built a machine. That's the part juries hate." She looked at Daniel. "How did you know to trace the part number?" "I used to figure out where things came from for a living," Daniel said. "Turns out it's the same whether it's a relief pallet or a stolen wheelchair. It did not end in that room, because real things rarely end in a single room. It ended over the following weeks in the slow, grinding way that institutional things end when somebody finally turns them on. The division filed. The frozen drafts were traced to an account that had not quite been emptied in time, and the money, what was left of it, began the long process of coming back. Ottinger himself did what the careful ones always do. He did not stand and fight. He surfaced through a lawyer in another state, made his careful, smooth noises about a misunderstanding and a dissolved business, and his own surprise, and discovered that surprise is not a defense when your name is on the back page in your own ink. He would not be dragged through Halden Forge in chains. That was never how this kind of evil ended. It ended with an account frozen, a license pulled, a state filing that would follow him into every future he tried to build, and 14 old people made whole. It ended with him made small. For the people he had robbed, small was enough. Small was, in fact, the entire point. Harlan Webb got a new chair, not from any program. Pete Quill drove up from Rampart Fab on a Saturday with a frame off his own good line strapped in the bed of his truck, a real one, with sealed bearings in the bearing housings and a brake that bit and a seat sling wide enough to hold a man. And he and Daniel spent the afternoon fitting it to the old man on the porch, while Boone supervised from the top step with his ears forward. They set Harlan in it and adjusted the footrests by feel, by his word. Lower, no, a touch higher. There, and the old man rolled himself the length of the porch and back, silent on the boards, and said nothing for a moment, and then said only, "It doesn't fight me." Then Daniel tore the bad ramp off the side of the house with a wrecking bar, and the plywood came away rotten at the screws, and underneath it the sawhorses Cardinal had left were the cheapest a yard sold. He built a new ramp the right way, gentle slope and solid rails set at a height a seated man could reach, and a grip surface scored deep enough to hold in glare ice. Pressure-treated lumber Earl Tibbets hauled over in his own truck and would not take a dime for. Half the town seemed to find a reason to come by while he did it. Della Pruitt brought her Aunt Lorna, who walked the new ramp with her hand on the rail and pronounced it sound. The diner cook brought a thermos of coffee and stayed to hold boards. Earl ran the drill and talked the whole time. Easy talk, the kind a town does over work, about gradients and church ramps and whose knees were worse. Sylvia Crane brought a pie still warm and her magnifying glass, and she sat on the step in her coat and read the new chair's actual warranty aloud to a man who could not see it. Every honest word of it, the real warranty off a real chair, and Harlan laughed for the first time in a long time at the plain, dull miracle of a piece of paper that was not trying to take anything from him. The thing about Daniel Mercer was that he had spent 4 years arriving in places after the worst had already happened, handing out water and blankets to people whose lives had already been taken apart, and leaving before he had to watch them try to put the pieces back. He had told himself that was the work. He had told himself the leaving was part of it. He had built a whole life out of the leaving. He did not leave Halden Forge. He noticed it slowly, the way you notice the cold lifting. He noticed it the morning. He realized. He knew which stool was his at the diner. He noticed it when Earl Tibbets asked him to look at a ramp at the Methodist Church, and he found himself thinking about gradients and ice and the particular needs of particular old knees, and caring about the answer. He noticed it most of all in the evenings in Harlan's kitchen, with the new chair rolling silent over the floorboards and the dog asleep under the table and an old blind man telling stories about a wife named Ruth, who would have caught the whole thing in the first sentence, and even though she could no more see it than he could, because she always could tell when a thing was built honest just by the sound your boots made going up it. "You could stay on, you know," Harlan said one night, not turning his face, which was his way of making a thing easy to say no to. "The daughter's room's just sitting there. The dog's already decided. He sleeps across that doorway like he's guarding the crown jewels." Daniel looked at the photographs he had never asked about. The woman with the kind, sharp face watching over a house her husband could not see and would not leave. He looked at Boone, who had lifted his head at the word stay, the way he lifted it at words that mattered. He thought about the truck with its full tank, parked now for 3 weeks at the end of Cobb Street, gathering snow like everything else that had decided to be still. "I think I might," he said. It was the truest sentence he had said aloud in years, and it came out plain. And the old house ticked and settled around it, and outside the snow kept on over Halden Forge, slow and steady and clean, and inside, for once nobody was leaving. Spring came to those mountains the way it always does, late and grudging, and then all at once the drafts of melt ran off the new ramp and never iced it. Harlan learned a new chair so well that he stopped thinking about it, which is the only real measure of a thing built right, that it lets you forget it. The case ground forward in its slow, lawful way, and one by one the old people who had been robbed in the dark got their money and their dignity returned to them in the daylight. And a regional care coordinator who had once sat in kitchens telling lonely people how lucky they were became a small, frozen footnote in a state filing. Which is a kind of justice that does not feel like fire, but lasts a great deal longer. And here is the part that is for you, watching, wherever you are tonight. There are people near you right now who are managing the way Harlan thought he was managing, proud and alone and one cold morning away from the ground. They will not ask. The asking is the very thing the pride forbids. So somebody has to do what a dog did on an icy lot before any human moved, which is to cross the distance without being asked and put a shoulder under the weight. And simply hold. You do not need a badge to do it. You do not need to be a Marine. You need only to be the one who looks when looking away would be so much easier, and who keeps looking until somebody who can fix it finally has to see. Goodness is not loud. It does not arrive in a black SUV with a smooth voice and a folder. It arrives quiet, with a shoulder and a screwdriver and a little stubborn refusal to drive on by. May God keep you and the people you love. May He give you the eyes to see the ones who are managing alone. And may you be, for someone, the stranger who stops. Stay warm out there and stay close to the ones who would catch you if you fell.